Today, we're really getting into something fundamental. It
Mm,
touches everything, our health, how we think, how we feel, especially important if you're studying psychology.
definitely.
We were talking about stress.
Stress. It's everywhere, isn't it?
Mm.
And you've got quite the stack of material for us here. Research, articles, all sorts of stuff on the psychology and physiology of it.
Yeah, a good pile. So, our mission today for this deep dive is really to unpack all that, pull out the crucial bits from these sources, give you, our listener, the science behind why we feel stressed, what's actually going on inside us, and, where it all comes from.
Sounds good. It's a core concept, and understanding the biology behind it is, well, key.
Absolutely. It's way more than just, a feeling. It's a whole body thing. Okay, so let's start right there, like the sources do. When we say stress, what are we actually defining?
Well, the sources frame it less as just something happening to us and more as our response to it. Specifically, it's how we react when we uh, perceive that the demands hitting us are, well, bigger than the resources we feel we have to cope.
That word perceive seems
Yeah.
really important there.
That was totally central. It underlines that stress is subjective, right? You could have two people facing the exact same thing, like a big presentation or a life change.
Right.
And one person feels completely overwhelmed, super stressed, while the other feels maybe challenged, but okay.
Yeah.
It's all down to how they individually size up the situation and what they think they can handle.
So it's like the filter we see the demand through, not just the demand itself. And this whole stress response, this being on edge feeling, it goes way back, doesn't it? That old fight or flight programming.
It does. Our basic stress biology evolved to handle immediate physical threats. Needing that sudden burst of energy to escape a predator or fight off an attacker, super useful for survival back then.
Makes sense.
But like the sources point out, a lot of our modern stress isn't a lion chasing us. It's more chronic psychological stuff.
Yeah.
The endless emails, money worries, deadlines.
Yeah.
Our ancient biology is trying to cope with these very modern, often non-physical pressures.
Right, right. Our body's ready for a sprint, but life feels like a never-ending marathon. Okay, so let's get into the mechanics. How does it actually work inside us? When we perceive that demand, where does it kick off in the body? This is where the sources get really interesting, diving into the neurobiology.
Yeah, it starts in the brain, naturally.
Yeah.
The initial thinking part happens up in the cerebral cortex,
Mhm.
specifically the prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
That's where you do that appraisal, sizing up the demand, thinking about the context, figuring out if you can cope.
So the cortex is doing that filtering you mentioned.
Exactly. And if the cortex decides, yep, this is threatening, or whoa, this is too much, it sends a signal down to the hypothalamus. You sort of think of the hypothalamus as the brain stress command center.
The boss.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Kicks off the whole physiological reaction. And from there, two main pathways get activated, running on different timelines.
Like a fast track and a slow track.
Precisely. First up is the sympathomedullary pathway, or SAM pathway. This is the really quick one, almost instant. It's responsible for that jolt you feel. Walter Cannon actually described this back in 1932, the classic fight or flight.
How does it work so fast?
Well, the hypothalamus flips on the sympathetic nervous system that's part of your autonomic system, the automatic stuff.
Hmm.
This directly zaps the adrenal medulla, the inner bit of your adrenal glands, which sit on your kidneys.
Okay.
And the adrenal medulla just floods your bloodstream with catecholamines, that's adrenaline, or epinephrine, and noradrenaline, norepinephrine.
Ah, the actual adrenaline rush.
That's the one. And those hormones trigger a whole bunch of rapid changes, all designed to get you ready for immediate physical action. Your heart pounds, blood pressure goes up, gets more oxygen to muscles.
Right.
You breathe faster, pupils get wider, blood shifts away from digestion to your big muscles, and glucose gets dumped into your blood for quick energy. Your body's
Sorry.
basically saying, run or fight, NOW.
Got it. That's the emergency button. But what about the stuff that just drags on, the chronic stress we talked about?
Right, for that longer-term stuff, the body uses the second pathway,
Mm-hmm.
the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis,
Mm-hmm.
the HPA axis. This one's a bit more complicated, slower to get going, and involves more hormones.
Okay, so walk me through that sequence.
Sure, the hypothalamus, still in charge, releases a hormone called CRH, corticotrophin-releasing hormone. CRH travels just a tiny distance to the pituitary gland right underneath it. The pituitary then pumps out ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, into the general bloodstream. ACTH travels down to the adrenal glands again, but this time it talks to the adrenal cortex, the outer layer.
And that's where cortisol comes in, the hormone we hear so much about with chronic stress.
Exactly. Cortisol is the main glucocorticoid released,
Yep.
and its job is different from adrenaline's. According to these sources, cortisol helps convert protein and fat into glucose for sustained energy. It can give the immune system a short-term boost, though, that flips later. It reduces inflammation temporarily and helps keep blood sugar steady over a longer period. It's about providing fuel and keeping things stable for a potential long haul.
Okay, so if SAM is the fire alarm and immediate evacuation plan,
Yeah.
the HPA axis is more like the backup generator, keeping essential systems running during a long power outage.
That's a pretty good way to put it. One's for the sudden shock, the other's for enduring the challenge.
And speaking of enduring, what happens when that HPA axis, that backup generator, is just running constantly? When the stress doesn't let up, that's when the serious health stuff starts piling up, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this brings us to the really classic work by Hans Selye from way back in the 1930s. Selye noticed this predictable pattern in how bodies respond physiologically to prolonged stress, no matter what caused it. He called it the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS.
The 3 stages, right? Alarm.
Stage 1 is the alarm reaction. Basically, it's that initial fight or flight response we covered, this SAM pathway kicking in. Body mobilizes everything. But interestingly, the sources note that resistance to the stressor is actually lower right at the start because resources are being shifted.
Makes sense. You're focused on the main threat, maybe dropping your guard elsewhere?
Kind of, yeah. If the stressor keeps going, you enter stage 2, resistance. Here, the body tries to adapt. The initial shock wears off a bit, but your physiological arousal stays higher than normal. You look like you're coping, but internally, the body is burning through energy and resources to keep up this heightened state.
So you might seem okay, but the engine's running really hot underneath.
Exactly. And that can't last forever. Eventually, Selye's model says you hit stage 3, exhaustion. The resources you use during alarm and resistance just run out. Your ability to cope is shot and body systems start to falter. This is the stage linked to getting sick more easily, organ damage, serious health problems.
Okay. Now, Selye's GAS was obviously huge, foundational stuff. But the sources also flag a key limitation, especially thinking about it from a psychology perspective.
Yes, a really important one. Selye was almost entirely focused on the physiological side. His model didn't really account for the psychological factors we started with, like how we appraise the stress, the coping strategies we use, whether we have social support.
Right.
Stress isn't just a physical machine wearing out.
Right.
Our thoughts, feelings, our social world, they massively shape the whole experience and the outcome.
Which leads us right into the direct damage chronic stress can do, the pathophysiology stuff detailed in these sources.
Yeah, that constant activation takes a toll everywhere. Cardiovascular health is a big one. All that adrenaline and cortisol keeps your heart rate and blood pressure up, leading to hypertension. That increases the risk for atherosclerosis, hardening arteries, and just puts a long-term strain on your heart.
And there was specific research mentioned linking stress tasks directly to heart issues.
Yes, like the Krantz study from '91. They found that even having people do stressful tasks in a lab could raise blood pressure and actually cause myocardial ischemia, basically.
Yeah.
Reduced blood flow to the heart muscle itself in people who were already susceptible. It shows a direct line from the stress response to heart function.
Wow, okay. And the immune system, you mentioned cortisol affects that too.
Significantly. So a quick burst of cortisol might initially ramp up some immune functions, but chronic high levels do the opposite. They suppress the immune system. The sources talk about things like fewer lymphocytes. Those are key immune cells. Inflammation, which is needed for healing, doesn't work as well, and wounds just don't repair as quickly.
The studies cited on that seemed pretty stark.
They really are. Like the Kekol-Glaser study in '95. They looked at people caring for spouses with Alzheimer's, a major chronic stressor, versus a control group. They gave everyone a tiny standard wound. In the caregivers, those wounds took, on average, 9 days longer to heal.
9 days.
Yeah. And then there's the Cohen study from '98. They measured people's stress levels, then deliberately exposed them to a cold virus. Those reporting higher chronic stress beforehand were significantly more likely to actually catch the cold.
So chronic stress makes you more likely to get sick and slower to get better. Oof. And of course, the psychological impact mentioned in the sources is huge too.
Or absolutely. Chronic stress is a major risk factor for developing things like major depression, various anxiety disorders. It can mess with your cognitive functions, memory, focus, making decisions, and it very often messes up your sleep, which just feeds back into the stress cycle. making you tired and less able to cope.
It really does hit everything, doesn't it? A total system overload.
Okay, so
Hmm.
if that's what stress is and what it does,
Yeah.
where is it all coming from in modern life? The sources look at different kinds of stressors.
Right. They start with the big stuff, major life events. This goes back to Holmes and Rahi in 1967 and their social readjustment rating scale, the SRRS. They identified 43 significant life events that force you to adapt and gave them points, or life change units, LCUs. And it wasn't just bad stuff, right? Good changes count, too.
Exactly. Things like death of a spouse scored highest, 100 LCUs, divorce was 73, but marriage was 50 LCUs.
Yeah.
Even positive things that require big adjustments, like getting married or even taking a vacation, contribute to the overall stress load. A minor traffic ticket was still 11 LCUs. The point is, change itself requires energy and adaptation, which can be stressful.
And did they link those scores to actual health problems?
They did. For example, the Rahi study in 1970 looked at Navy sailors. They measured their LCU scores before deployment and then tracked their health during deployment. They found a positive correlation, modest but statistically significant, meaning higher LCU scores predicted a greater chance of getting sick later on.
Okay, so big life shifts matter, but then the sources suggest that maybe the little things, the everyday grind, can actually be worse. Daily hassles.
Yeah, this line of research from Kanner, DeLongis, and others in the 80s argue that for many people, the constant drip, drip, drip of minor irritations might actually be more damaging to health and mood than those big, infrequent events.
Like being stuck in traffic again, the Wi-Fi dropping out, that annoying email.
Exactly. All those little things.
Mhm.
Traffic, deadlines, money worries, tech problems, minor arguments.
Yeah.
Individually, they're small, but they add up, creating this chronic background hum of stress that just wears you down, maybe even more than one big shock followed by a recovery period.
Mm-hmm.
But importantly, the sources also bring in the idea of uplifts here, the small positive things that happen each day.
Like what?
Like having a nice chat with someone, finishing a task, enjoying a hobby, a moment of kindness. These little positive boosts can help counteract the negative drag of the daily hassles.
That's a useful balance. But okay, one huge, often chronic source of stress for so many people is work. The workplace.
Definitely. The sources really zero in on this. They tend to list about 5 key factors that make work stressful. Just the sheer volume of workload, having a lack of control over your tasks or schedule,
Mm-hmm.
a physical environment noise, crowding, safety, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Role-related stressors, like not being sure what you're supposed to do or having conflicting demands. And finally, difficult interpersonal relationships with bosses or coworkers.
Workload seems obvious, but that lack of control idea keeps popping up in these materials, doesn't it?
It really does. It seems to be a massive factor in the research on workplace stress. Karasek's job demand control model from '79 is really key here. His argument was that job stress isn't just about how much you have to do the demands.
Right.
It's about the interaction between those demands and how much control or autonomy you have in deciding how and when to do the work.
So having a lot to do isn't automatically stressful if you feel like you're in the driver's seat.
That's the core idea, yeah. The model says the really bad combination, the high-strain job, is high demands plus low control. That's the recipe for stress. If you have high demands but also high control, that's seen as an active job. Challenging, maybe, but also potentially engaging and allows for learning. Low demand, low control is passive, maybe boring.
And did other big studies support this focus on control?
Oh yeah, the Whitehall study is a huge piece of evidence mentioned here. Bosma and colleagues, in '97, studied thousands of British civil servants in different job grades. What they found was striking. It wasn't just how much work people had that predicted heart problems, it was the level of control. Lower grade workers, who had less say over their work, had significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease than higher grade workers with more autonomy, even when workloads were similar.
Wow. So it wasn't just being busy, it was feeling powerless while being busy.
That sums it up really well.
Yeah.
And there's another classic study they mentioned, Johansson's Swedish sawmill study from '78. It was like a natural experiment.
Mm-hmm.
They compared 2 groups. Finishers on a machine-paced line, they had no control over speed, repetitive work, were isolated, but responsible for everyone's bonus. Basically, high stress.
Okay.
They compared them to maintenance workers who had varied tasks, more flexibility, social contact, less direct output pressure, lower stress.
And the results show the difference.
Clearly, the high-stress finishers had higher levels of stress hormones like adrenaline all day long, higher body temps suggesting constant metabolic effort. They smoked more, drank more caffeine, and crucially, they had higher rates of illness and took more sick days. It really showed the physical and behavioral cost of that high-demand, low-control setup.
So yeah, across different kinds of research models, big population studies, even specific workplace comparisons, that lack of control theme is consistently linked to higher stress.
It's a really robust finding in the material we looked at.
Okay, wow. We've covered a ton: what stress is, how it works biologically, the damage it does long term, where it comes from. Now, thinking like a psychology student or someone really digging into this, it's super important to evaluate the research itself, right? What do the sources say about the strengths and weaknesses of how we study stress?
Right, critical evaluation is key. And the sources do highlight strengths. Stress research uses pretty rigorous methods, overall lab experiments with physiological measures, large field studies tracking people over time. They use objective markers like cortisol levels or blood pressure alongside people's own reports, giving a fuller picture. And many studies use big samples, which helps.
And it's not just theory, it has real-world uses.
Exactly. That's a major strength of practical applications. This research helps design workplace programs to reduce stress, informs clinical treatments for anxiety or stress-related health issues, guides public health campaigns.
But looking critically, like you need to do when you're learning this stuff, there are definitely limitations mentioned too.
Oh, for sure. And these are crucial points for anyone studying psychology. Methodologically, a lot of the research, especially outside the lab, is correlational. It shows stress and illness often go together, but proving stress caused the illness is tricky because so many other things could be involved.
Right, correlation isn't causation.
Exactly. Then there's the huge variation between people, how we perceive stress, how we react. Group studies don't always capture that individual difference well. And a lot of the tools, like the SRS Life Events scale, were developed in Western cultures, so they might not apply perfectly everywhere, potential cultural bias.
So you can't just assume findings from one group automatically apply to everyone else.
You have to be cautious, yeah. There are also theoretical limits. Early models, like Salih's GAS, can seem a bit reductionist, boiling down this complex human experience to just physiology. They can also be a bit static, not fully showing how stress, coping, and outcomes change dynamically over time.
And just measuring stress accurately is hard too, isn't it?
It is. If you ask people how stressed they are, their answers can be biased. Maybe they want to seem like they're coping well, or maybe they're just in a bad mood that day. In lab studies, people might guess what the study is about and change how they act, demand characteristics. And in real-world studies, controlling for every single other factor that might affect both stress and health lifestyle, genetics, socioeconomic status, is incredibly difficult. Those are confounding variables.
Those are really vital points to keep in your head when you're reading studies or even thinking about doing research yourself.
Absolutely essential for a sophisticated understanding.
Okay, so given all those complexities and how our understanding has evolved, where are things heading now? What are the current perspectives and future directions mentioned in these sources?
Well, the field has definitely shifted beyond just looking at the negative physical stuff. Modern research puts way more emphasis on cognitive appraisal, how we think about stressors. There's a much bigger focus now on coping resources, resilience factors, what helps people bounce back or even grow from stress. And the idea of neuroplasticity, how our brains can actually change in response to stress, for better or worse, is a hot area.
So, not just how does stress break us down, but how do we manage it, maybe even benefit from overcoming challenges?
Exactly. And some specific emerging areas mentioned are things like epigenetics, how stress might change how our genes are expressed without changing the DNA itself. The whole gut-brain axis thing, the link between our gut bacteria and our mental state is huge now. Then there's stress related to technology being always on, and importantly, a focus on understanding stress in vulnerable groups who might face more stressors with fewer resources.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's bring it all home. Why is this whole deep dive, the biology, the models, the studies, the critiques, why is it so important for you, the listener, especially if you're interested in psychology?
Because truly understanding these foundations, how stress works, from perception down to physiology, its effects, its sources, and the science behind it all, that's the bedrock for developing effective ways to actually help people.
So, knowing the why and the what tells us the how for interventions.
Precisely. And the sources touch on interventions at different levels, all stemming from this knowledge. For individuals, it informs things like cognitive restructuring, changing those appraisals, teaching relaxation techniques to manage the physical response, time management skills, building social support.
Okay.
At an organizational level, it points towards things like redesigning jobs to give people more control, managing workloads better, creating supportive environments at work, and even broader, at a societal level, it's about public health campaigns, maybe policy changes to reduce major stressors, and getting stress management support integrated into healthcare communities.
It really takes a multi-pronged approach, drawing on all these different layers of understanding we've talked through.
It's a complex problem, no doubt,
Yep.
and tackling it effectively requires that deep scientific grounding.
Well, this has certainly been a thorough deep dive into this material on stress. We've gone from, ancient brain wiring for fight or flight right up to the pressures of the modern office and looked critically at how we even know all this stuff. It's
Yeah.
really clear stress is this intricate dance between our biology, our minds, and the world around us.
And for anyone involved in psychology, really getting to grips with this foundation is just invaluable for understanding people and figuring out how to support well-being.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into stress. And as you reflect on everything we've unpacked from these sources, here's a final thought to chew on. We know chronic stress takes a massive toll on health, physical and mental. So how can we as individuals, and maybe more importantly, as a society focused on psychological health, shift our focus from just coping with stress after it hits towards actively building resilience before it hits, and maybe even designing our environments, our workplaces, our communities to be less toxic in the first place?
That's a really crucial question, isn't it? Big implications for the future.
Definitely something to think about. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.